So
I think, like, I'm remembering this woman I met in the 2014 umbrella movement at the Admiralty protest site, and she was in her 40s, probably. And most of I think a lot of the face of the protest movement were students, like teenagers or people in their early 20s. But like we had a lot of people tell us is that even the older people is that like they never dreamed that Hong Kong could have that kind of society where people took care of each other. And I remember how like thrilled and happy she was about this whole idea that like her entire life she had felt that Hong Kong was kind of a cold place where a lot of people just cared about making money. And then to see this kind of protest movement blossom on the streets where she felt like, here is finally like a community where people get together and they take care of each other.
Yeah, it like brought out the best in people.
And I think that that is a very hard thing to kill, even with all of the terrible persecution and trauma that's happened to Hong Kong in the years since that. I think it's like very hard to kind of like kill that feeling in a person once they've experienced it for themselves and once they felt kind of empowered by that.
It doesn't mean the Communist Party is not going to try.
Yeah, that's true.
So how is the Hong Kong Democracy Council kind of dealing with this? Like, everyone is recovering from like the trauma of it. There is the damage to the trust. Like, what is the way forward?
Yeah, so that is a very essential question that we are still grappling with. But the Hong Kong Democracy Council actually started in 2019 as more an advocacy-focused organization. So its establishment was mostly to pass legislations on the Hill, because back then there was an entire movement in Hong Kong, right? And the HADC was more like an arm to help push some sort of agenda and some sort of wish of Hong Kongers abroad. But now with the movement in exile, we have to reimagine what HADC is like. So in the past year, we've actually expanded our work into, not only work on advocacy, but also diaspora building and research production. And for diaspora building, specifically, it's exactly about building that trust and that coherence among our peers from the society. So actually, a few months ago, we organized a Hong Kong Summit where we have over 100 Hong Konger community members come together to Washington, D.C. for a 3-day conference. And it was quite a heartwarming scene because, it's my first time since 2020 to have that many Hong Kongers together in a room to talk about a movement together and to talk about what we can do together. And even though these people, we have been working together since 2019, but actually a lot of us have not really met each other in person. So that day was like a huge like internet friends meeting or some sort of like Tinder meeting, or everyone was on a blind date that people were just saying, oh, hi, you are like this person I've been speaking to for 3 years.
They found out you're not a man.
Yeah, I'm not exactly. That was awkward, but it's crazy. But I think this sort of face-to-face meeting is so important because once you have met each other, what you're developing is not only that sort of comradeship in the movement, but actually genuine friendship and genuine care for each other. And so in that conference and that summit, we also talked about, how the movement should be structured going forward, or how Hong Kongers in the US, what we can do, what we can collaborate on together, to really try to keep the movement alive. So some things that we're thought of is to have, more town hall meetings of Hong Kongers, to, have collaborative campaigns, for example, on the HAETO, the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Offices in the US, that is de facto, the Hong Kong Embassy, and they do a lot of propaganda stuff here in the US, to have that sort of campaigns to wage against the Hong Kong government. So recently there was this global financial summit in Hong Kong organized by the Hong Kong government. And what they wanted to do was they invited a lot of CEOs from like Citibank, Morgan Stanley, this sort of the most well-known international finance institutions to Hong Kong, and they would share a stage with John Lee to talk about, how Hong Kong is a great city for business, how business is back. So the Hong Kongers in the United States reacted with a campaign that we try to pressure these CEOs from attending that summit, because what they do is actually given credibility to John Lee, right? And that is not something we want to see for sure. But of course, people inside of Hong Kong do not have the freedom or liberty to say that. But we, as Hong Kongers outside, as Hong Kongers in the United States, we can actually campaign around it. So we, HADC published a report on, all these companies. And then we also had a joint letter. And eventually, the CECC on Congress actually published a statement of how these CEOs should not attend the summit. And right after that, we started seeing, 5 CEOs consecutively dropping out of the summit. And they were using excuses like they got tested for COVID, or weather concern because there was a typhoon in Hong Kong, but that typhoon was not, even that strong. In Hong Kong always has a lot of typhoon, but Hong Kong is able to weather through it. So they were using very blatant excuses that we know is actually succumbing to public pressure to not attend the summit anymore. So these are some things that we're still trying to do. And hopefully with more campaigns and projects like this that can include more Hong Kongers, we can create that momentum again and let people feel like they are doing something and they're not as powerless as they think. Because I think that idea of powerlessness is really very detrimental to what each person can do. And once they think that they can actually make changes, everyone can be mobilized. Everyone can give their 100%. And that's what we're trying to build here, a political diaspora that is able to mobilize itself, sustain itself, and push itself forward, together in this movement to make sure we see more changes ahead of us.
You mentioned in your speech at the Oslo's Freedom Forum that there was a period of time where you felt that even though you were physically free in the US, that you felt like you were still mentally imprisoned by the Chinese Communist Party. Could you talk a little bit about that and how you broke out of that?
Yeah, for sure. So actually that was during the period where I had to decide whether I wanted to stay anonymous or whether I wanted to come forward, as an advocate for Hong Kong. And I think at that time it was very difficult. The struggle was very difficult because I was thinking, if I wanted to reserve the freedom to go back to Hong Kong, to visit my friends, whatever, then I cannot actually say anything outside because the national security law, they would use their territorial boundaries, which is non-existent. They can even, arrest an ET or an UFO if they wish to, but they can use that to actually arrest me for anything I say outside of Hong Kong. So if I want to go back to Hong Kong, I cannot say anything here. I cannot even share a Facebook post or Twitter post, about what's going on inside of Hong Kong. And also at that time, I felt like if I'm not able to say anything, of course, I'm not going to make a change. But on the other hand, I was thinking, even if I come out, as an advocate, as a voice to speak for Hong Kong, what can I do? I'm just a person against this totalitarian regime that's arguably, I think, the largest in this century. And that sort of hopelessness and helplessness is really what changed me. I was so attached to the idea that I cannot contribute to the movement. I would not be able to make a change. And I think that sentiment is shared by a lot of my peers as well. Every one of us alone in our bedroom, thinking we cannot make a change, thinking we're so futile, so small. And that is exactly the sort of mental prison that I'm referring to. Somehow we are boxed into thinking that we're useless. We're boxed into thinking that we're just very tiny individuals against this regime. But actually, in fact, we are not. And we should not think that we're useless, right? Because together, we have achieved, for example, 2014 and 2019. That was a positive step of the Hong Kong civil society, even though it ultimately, faced a huge crackdown. But still, nobody imagined, as you have said, Hong Kong would have that sort of vibrant society, right? But what is it made up of? Is made up of people like us, individuals like us. And that is exactly why we cannot keep thinking that we're useless or powerless against a regime. That is exactly what the regime wants us to think with the crackdown, with the police violence, with dismantling our trust. And that is why I think, for us to actually achieve any changes in this movement, we have to first remember we're not useless, we're not powerless. Everyone can find their role, everyone can find their use and their contribution in this movement. And only with this sort of flexibility, imagination, then you can start actually seeing there are a lot of possibilities ahead of us. Of course, failure is one of the possibilities, but also there's also victory, there's also liberation. And that's why we have to break out of that feeling or idea of already rejecting ourselves and to really think ahead and to see how we can move forward.